is a PhD researcher and program leader of animation at De Montfort University. Their current research, Disrupting the Imagined Insect World, Biophilia and Biophobia, through the animated lens, explores insect representation in cinema. Sorry, that was the timer. Primarily in horror from both a contextual and practical perspective. They have a psychoanalytical approach to film discussion and practice, focusing on the affect, unconsciousness, and experience of cinema and how this space can be disrupted. Occulta's background is in horror films, previously working as a practical special effects artist and lead animator for Trauma Entertainment's feature films. Their presentation today is Matter Without Meaning, the Anarchic Unconscious and the Liminal Horror Space. All right, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma, for that introduction. So today I'm going to present a collection of developing and ongoing research that explores the need of our cinematic liminal space to be redefined through the lens of psychoanalytical theory and my own experience as a practice-based researcher. So traditionally, we have defined liminal spaces by their transitional, familiar, and ambiguous qualities. These are spaces which are stuck between two phases to create an ambivalent vacuum where we anticipate certainty or an arrival to some sort of destination. However, the persistent imagery of liminal spaces in our horror cinema suggests there is much more evocative potential at play in these environments than simple or expectant unease. They have a deeply psychological effect on the horror viewer, being able to reach into our subconscious, generating fear and dread through the various algorithms provided by liminal conditions. It is because of this, I argue, the traditional definitions of liminal space, particularly in cinema, are both inadequate and in need of reevaluation. When we are presented with a liminal environment, the balance of both objectivity and subjectivity become disturbed. Our external experience becomes unregulated and displaced from the internal interpretations that define our material existence. It's through the disruption of objective and subjective experience that we become vulnerable to the truth beyond our ideological fantasies. And it is here that we find true horror. So, for example, I have this cup. It's not just any cup. I have an evocative relationship with it that defines it. This was a free gift. It was a goodie from my first conference talk. It is a special cup. And it's here that my understanding of it is established. If theoretically I could displace the personal symbolic order I've imposed upon it, it would distort my own distortion. The distortion being this synthetic, self-validating, ego-driven narrative I have forced on it. And with this, the fictional space between myself and the cup becomes more visible. For this reason, the cup would begin to become uncanny, as my human reality is shaped by this exact virtualization and relationship of subjectivity over objectivity. If we disrupt this balance, the symbolic distortions that sustain the fragility of the human psyche and our fictionalized reality become vulnerable, as does the truth within them. My subjectively driven definition of the cup and the contours of desire that surround my idealization of it would start to become overwhelmed and no longer mine, awarding the cup an ontological subjectivity. My distortive understanding of reality is now answerable to this cup, and with it, my own structure of human comprehension. The symbolic mechanisms that shape my reality are now threatened, and the cup starts to become free from ideological regulation. This formula applied to the cinematic environment is liminal space. It is my argument, it is not transition or in-betweenness that creates liminal cinematic dread, but instead it is the displacement of our internal and external experience. If our symbolic mode of reality is disturbed and abstractified, the material world has the potential to seize control of our ideological fictions, and it is here that we find true horror. The present potential for a material ontological world that operates beyond us, freed from the symbolic fictions that regulate them, creates the condition of matter without meaning, where we too become objects in the process as we are disconnected from this symbolic order. By Deleuze and Guattari's psychoanalytical construct of the body without organs, the liminal space becomes matter without meaning, in that, much like the body without organs, the unregulated potential of a liminal space operates freely from the ideology imposed upon it. In the liminal world, we lose control of the symbolic fictions that regulate our reality. And in the process, we find spaces that threaten to expose the reality within these fictions. The environmental disfiguration of our ideological experience allows the aspects of our unconscious to become disembodied, allowing it to govern a space and treating us as objects or test subjects within it, which is quite literally the case and the liminal conditions of the TV series Squid Game, the cult classic The Cube, or the horror film feature Vivarium, to name a few. So, the tension and discomfort of liminal space is the threat that this symbolic fiction and our subjective experience will be consumed by the unconscious liminality. In this instance, we fully transition into the space, and the objective and subjective roles of being an ontology would become so distorted that these symbolic fictions become obstacles only to their own formulation. And by further distorting the various elements at play, we begin to remove these distortions themselves. When the conditions of the liminal space have been realized, what we are left with is the affect of its own distortions. This is what Lacan would refer to as the real. The effectiveness of a liminal space in cinema is directly linked to that which is readily symbolically identifiable, with this being mangled, rearranged, and obscured. There are many illusions at play in the mechanisms of our reality that are universally shared, as are the aspects of the unconscious that provide the homogeny in subtle dread. So, for example, Lynch's experimental series, Rabbits, provides a recipe for all the elements that provide liminal cinematic conditions. The environment is both domestic and synthetic, translating as a set, but also disturbing the recognition of both domesticity and spectator. There is a male-dominated and conservative dynamic presented by the characters. The female is ironing, the male is reading a paper, another woman is watching TV. Yet, the obvious problem, these are rabbits, similar to that of doll's house toys or even lab rabbits, creating a displacement of subjectivity. As they talk, their voices are disembodied, out of sync, and appear outside of the environment, further elevating the sense of the synthetic, but also a relation to childlike play, yet it is a hostile one. This presents us with aspects of Freud's definition of the unconscious, the duality of the innocent but malicious child that sits beneath our societal integration, or the id. One of the female figures facilitates servitude, later being the only character to directly address the audience, questioning the nightmarish conditions. She is the ego. The male figure controls the space, being met with canned applause and synthetic fanfare. We and the two female rabbits await his arrival, and he is the focus of the space's attention. Here we observe the superego. The material setting becomes consumed by the freedom awarded to both the id and the superego as the symbolic order is disrupted across the aesthetic arrangement. The real threat is what is outside the door. We are made aware of invisible confrontations which are kept hidden from us. We could theorize that beyond the door is a back room, a doorway that leads to the real, one that is too agonizing to confront, even within the the barriers of cinematic fantasy. The frequent inclusion of the unconscious constructs in our cinematic liminality commonly surface precisely because the exposure to displaced subjectivity connects directly to the internal survival mechanism that requires these symbolic fictions, which relates to trauma, our growing experiences, and integration into a horrifically ideological world that we are unconsciously aware is a synthetic fast food reality. For example, the character of Jack in The Shining slips further into liminality as his mental state deteriorates. By the end, Jack loses grasp of the subjective human reality, transformed into an object and absorbed by the hotel. Beyond the film, we could theorize Jack enters the back rooms and becomes the real in the process. This process of mental decay and assimilation into the liminal otherworld is also observed in films such as Donnie Darko, In Fabric, and The Cell. The threat is the potential to be absorbed into the liminal otherworld, and being abstractified and objectified by its truths is further present in the placement of the voyeur. The character of Jeffrey in Blue Velvet, for example, hides in the closet of Dorothy's apartment, a space where all moral and ideological regulation are both suspended, exposing the unconscious dynamics that lie beneath. Both Frank and Dorothy are positioned as objects, or rabbits, to call back to rabbits, which was referenced earlier in this talk. Frank is a partial object, Dorothy a pure object, used by the oppressive environment and driven by the displacement of Jeffrey's unconscious. Jeffrey witnesses a peep show that is shaped by the trauma and bereavement of his father's passing. He acts as our ego, supported by his voyeuristic status and reluctancy to see the full horror of the real, quite literally with the obstruction of the slats of the door. Jeffrey's disembodied unconscious shapes the ontology of this space. Frank Booth oscillates between superego and id, presenting as Jeffrey's patriarchal puppet, a monstrous interpretation of authority as he sexually dominates Dorothy. He is eventually exposed, humiliated by his own impotence. Dorothy is degraded and powerless to the assault, with no will to stop it. She is the object of desire with an emphasis on object. It is Frank who is the poltergeist of Jeffrey's unconscious, who inflicts the childhood traumas and griefs upon Dorothy and the space in the process. This notion is furthered by the appearance of liminality in children's media, where we are presented with a variety of undead objects, obscured realities, and suspended otherworlds. Children are yet to be fully assimilated into the symbolic order, and thus the same conditions don't threaten them, and the liminal space is a much more accurate depiction of a child's reality, as their subjective relationship with the external world is a developmental one. This in turn gives insight into why many of our liminal spaces in horror cinema pull from childlike aesthetics, nostalgically calling back to this pre-symbolic time we share to provide a further layer of uncanny. As Zizek remarks, cinema does not show us what we desire, it tells us what we desire. And with our cinematic idealization of human existence comes the experimental space to unconsciously explore its absence. We do not have access to a non-symbolic version of the world, yet a liminal space attempts to redefine, abstractify, and rearrange the fictional order of reality. Our cinematic liminal spaces threaten us with an intimate intervention. Through cinema, ideological displacement, and our external experience, the impenetrable truths of our human existence begin to loom over us. By temporarily suspending or removing the desires of cinema, we become vulnerable to the exact truths behind them, the reality in our illusions. In horror cinema, the organization of desire, interpellation, and spectator, typical in film, to navigate our understanding, start to become parallaxed, rearranging objectivity, idealism, and subjectivity, and the sublime distortion of ideology becomes further distorted. Desire both overwhelms and abandons the space, disrupting this symbolic order. In liminality, we are presented with an unregulated symbolic realm rather than being positioned within one. And with this, we begin to see how these symbolic networks function. If you detach or lose control over the distortions of our symbolic fictions from the material artifacts that they are imposed upon, we begin to lose the distortions that narrate human purpose, causing a confrontation with desire and an exposure to realms that operate beyond us. The real fear being the nothingness of symbolic order abandoning us, spaces where God is dead and never existed to begin with. Thank you for your time. If you would like to learn more about my research and how psychoanalysis factors into my animated practice, or just to connect, my socials are on screen. And I'm done. Thank you for your time.
Stop sharing.
Cool. Sorry, it took me a minute to work out how to turn it off.